Good morning to everyone who has joined us today for the podcast launch of Voices in Action and its series, Rethinking Equality. My name is Ana Maria Ibáñez. I am the Vice President of Sectors and Knowledge at the IDB and the host of this podcast. Today we are here to talk about inequality, an urgent issue that concerns us and motivated the creation of the Latin American and Caribbean Inequality Review last year, a network of academics created to understand why, despite the significant economic and social changes in Latin America and the Caribbean, inequality persists at exceptionally high levels. We launched last year in 2021, together with the London School of Economics, Yale University, and the Institute for Fiscal Studies. More than 60 academics from the region and from universities in many other regions participated in this effort, and we produced 27 research papers. They are all available online. You can read all these papers. Joining us today is the president of the IDB, Ilan Goldfang. Welcome, President. We also have Morgan Doyle, the IDB's representative in Brazil, and two members of LACIR, Ana de la O, who is an associate professor at Yale University, and Horacio Atanasio, who is Cowles Professor of Economics, also from Yale University. Both have been instrumental in LACIR research and LACIR itself. So welcome to this roundtable. The idea behind this podcast series and our roundtable today is to discuss the finding with the academics themselves, where they explain the different dimension of inequality, the causes and the consequences as well. We will have 12 episodes capturing valuable expertise on different facets of inequality. We will also hear voices from the region to get a sense how inequality is lived through the lives of our citizens and how the IDB is contributing to tackle this challenge in the region. Today, we will share the first two episodes, and you can listen to them on your favorite podcast platform. I hope you enjoyed the result as much as we have been enjoying the process of doing it. Before jumping into the question, let me give you a little bit of snippets of the data that we have. There are many data points about inequality, but let me share one with you. Inequality is a global challenge. It's not only for Latin America and the Caribbean. Unfortunately, Latin America and the Caribbean has more inequality than most regions in the world except sub-Saharan Africa. The top 10% of the population earns 22 times more than the bottom 10%. And this is just a headline. If we dig a little, the studies reveal really a multidimensional and complex reality in the region. There are inherited factors that determine how unequal we are, such as ethnicity, race, parents' education, and geography. There are factors of economic policy that contribute to increase inequality, but also, and very importantly so, to reduce inequality. There are factors such as the degree of concentration of production in few or many companies, the design of tax or pension systems, and the level of informality in the labor market. All these factors form a very complex dynamic that contributes to maintaining inequality at high levels in our region. With that overview, I will pass the first question to our president, Ilan Goldfang. President, let's really start with the basics. Why it is so important to tackle the issue of inequality in the region, and how can the work of LACIR help?
Thank you, Ana Maria, for the welcome, the introduction. Thank you all for being here, Ana Maria, Ana de la O, and Horacio, and my colleague Morgan. It's a really honor to be with you in this podcast and to be part of this project of LACIR with so many respected academics doing great work. To your question, why is the issue of inequality so important? Well, let me start with the main point. Latin America is one of the most unequal, if not the most unequal, region in the world. So it is in the first order that we need to tackle that. And when you look around, it is not coincidence that one of our main strategic objective of our strategy that we have just approved in our last annual meeting for the next 6 years is about poverty and inequality. It has to be. When you look at G20, we have the Brazilian presidency this year. They have introduced a topic which was not in the previous G20s, and it's about poverty, hunger, and they were discussing inequality just a week ago in Brazil. So yes, it is quite important. Let me give you some data to just show how important has this been, the research at the LACIR network, just basic data. Distribution of wealth. There are several countries in Latin America where the concentration of wealth of the highest 1% is around 40%. This is higher than 20 to 30% that you find in Europe, which we have found is also unequal. So we are more unequal than unequals by quite a margin. So it is something that we need to work and overcome. But let me give you more detail coming from the LACIR, more granular, detailed work. More than half of the inequality that affects current generation is inherited. So it's not based on what the current generation is doing, but basically what it inherits. It means that the status of the person can be attributed to factors that it inherited at birth. This inherited inequality ranges from 44 to 60%, depending on the country. So either half or more than half depends on what was your luck at birth. Researchers from LACIR identify several factors on this inherited inequality. Education of the parents accounts 60%. Think about it, 60% depends on the education of your parents. Where you were born, another 20%. The occupation of your parents, another 11%. Not only the education of your parents, but the occupation of your parents, too. And the race, another 10%. Things that, of course, whoever is born cannot change. It is inherited. So that tells us that for many people in the Latin America and the Caribbean, the place you were born, the education level of your parents, and others are determining factors of your future well-being. So these realities will allow us to have a better handle on what do we need to do in terms of policies and measures that will help countries reduce the level of inequality and try to provide more opportunities to citizens in Latin America and the Caribbean. And that brings me to the second part of your question, which was how the LACIR network fits into this picture, how it can help us. Well, ideas are powerful tools. Knowledge diffusion even more. Ideas shape the course of history, say John Maynard Keynes. It's very important. So it's through partnerships like the LACIR that we can unlock our potential as a knowledge bank. Thanks to such partnership, we generate rigorous evidence and data that we can share with our counterparts in the countries in the region. We have been champion impact, evidence-based policies. Our strategy is called Impact Plus, which is basically what the LACIR and your work is helping us do. Thank you.
Thank you very much, President. Horacio, you have contributed to the LACIR network not only through your research, but also through the steering committee, and for that we are very grateful. You are familiar with the region, with its bright and dark sides, and the President was mentioning evidence and the data that we know about inequality. In Latin America, we know that 8 out of 10 people believe that income distribution is unjust in our region and that there are significant inequalities. After collecting and analyzing all available data, which Glacier did for many of our countries, how close is really our perception to the diagnosis you made? How different is from really the evidence that we have about that? And how persistent has been inequality in our region, and how has it evolved over the years?
Thank you, Ana Maria. First of all, thanks very much for this opportunity to be here and to discuss with you, everybody around this table, about the project, the Glacier project, and what we have done. One thing that I would like to mention before I try to answer your questions, is that a fundamental feature of Glacier and the steering committee and the panel that has made Glacier possible is the interdisciplinarity. I'm a card-carrying economist, I would say, but within both the steering committee and the panel, there are a variety of disciplines, and I've been learning very much from there. There's a political scientist like Anna, epidemiologist, sociologist, and so on and so forth. And I think that's important because as was implicit in some of the things that the President yourself said, inequality is not just inequality in income, it's inequality in wealth, it's inequality in health, it's inequality in political voice, it's inequality in more general well-being and dignity around the region. And I think it's very important to make that clear, and also try to relate that to the drivers of inequality, which part of it might be inheritance, not in the parental sense, but historical legacies. As you mentioned, the nature of commodities and labor markets, the nature of the role of informality, and also the somewhat different in the continent role that governments play. Some governments in the region try to reduce inequality, other governments don't do that much, if not negative. So in terms of answering your question, I think first of all, it's become clear, and I learned even more than I knew before, is that inequality cannot be summarized by a single number. It's not just the Gini coefficient. And this is partly because it's the entire distribution that moves in different ways. Could be the top 10%, the bottom 10%, or the middle, or the disappearing of the middle. And all these dimensions in the distribution might have very different implications and consequences. And second, because as I mentioned, inequality can have different dimensions. And some may be perceived as fair, and others may be perceived as deeply unfair. The President was referring to the origin. I'm sure we'll get back to that, to the parental background. But there are other dimensions. For instance, what happens within families. There is evidence now that about 40% in many Latin American countries, for which there are data, 40% of inequality across educational attainments is accounted for inequality among siblings. So they have the same origin, but yet there's a substantial part of inequality. Where does that come from? It comes from how decisions are made within families on how to allocate resources. And the final thing that I wanted to say is that I said the different dimensions. One that often has been missing in the analysis is inequality in dignity, inequality in political voice, but also recognition of belonging to a society. And that shapes very much how societies work. There is in philosophy the contributions of Elizabeth Anderson and others that talk about the relational inequality. And you can go back to Adam Smith when he talked about the role of a white linen shirt. To have dignity, you have to own a white linen shirt, regardless of your income, so that you can go out and be recognized as a respectable and contributing member of society. All that is missing a lot in Latin America, and that affects how people perceive the situation, as you were saying, and other dimensions of inequality. What happened to the dynamics? The moment you start looking at all these dimensions, it's very difficult to understand. Over income, we've seen some decline and then going up again, but as I said, it's not the only dimension we'll be looking at. I think, unfortunately, progress has been very, very slow in the continent.
Thank you, Horacio. And you mentioned a very important idea of how inequality is related to dignity as well, which is very important, and belonging to a society. And now I turn to you. You are also part of the steering committee, and we are also very grateful with all your contributions through your research and through the steering committee. We know in Latin America that high inequality and lack of economic growth have been at the center of the discussion in recent years. This is not a new discussion. However, this discussion really has not led to the needed changes that we need to implement in the region. I would like to ask you what can explain the current difficulty of our countries in making the necessary changes that could reduce inequality. We saw in the early 1990s till 2014 that there was a reduction in inequality of income that was important, driven by economic growth, and very importantly so by state action, with the expansion of education and also with the expansion of various social programs. So it is possible. Governments can help reduce inequality. So why are we not implementing these necessary changes?
Thank you so much, Ana Maria. First, I want to start by saying that I'm very pleased to be here today and that I am grateful for last year for including a whole theme trying to evaluate the political aspects of this problem of inequality. On your question, I think it is very important to realize that the region has proven itself that they can reduce inequality. And indeed, in the period that you mentioned, we saw both left-leaning governments and right-leaning governments implementing very progressive policies. And as you mentioned, this happened in a context of very positive external conditions. And now we fast forward to the second decade of the 2000s, we see the end of the commodity boom. And I see with this, we start seeing very clearly that our political systems produce two interlocked deficits, a deficit of representation and a deficit of responsiveness. And by this, I mean that the preferences of citizens are not reflected in the elected representatives or in the policies that they implement. And various of the chapters in last year give very interesting insight on these two dimensions. And I want to mention just a couple of them. Noam Lupu has a chapter where he shows very clearly that citizens' preferences are not represented in legislatures. And various last year chapters, I think, give important insights on this respect. Noam Lupu shows that in the region, citizens' preferences are not really reflected in the legislators that they elect. And indeed, he measures with surveys the ideological orientation of legislators, and he can compare those ideological orientations to the preferences of citizens because he has very similar types of questions. So he's comparing apples to apples in this sense. And what he finds is that actually legislators' positions are to the right than even the position of the richest quintile of citizens responding to surveys. So really, the median position of the legislator in our region is far to the right than the average voter. And another piece of evidence from last year papers come from work by Leopoldo Ferguson, James Robinson, and Santiago Torres, where they show that newcomers or people who win elections for the first time in local elections implement very similar types of policies than old-guard politicians. So in some sense, we see that there is political contestation in the region, but new political actors, new political parties are really not making a big difference in terms of the policies that they implement. Now, why is this happening? And here, Noam Lupu's chapter makes the case that what is going on is that in many of our countries, we have very weak political party systems. So party systems that have very weak institutionalization and political parties that have very low discipline. Now, this is more of a problem currently because there are very few low-hanging fruits in terms of policies to reduce inequality. And so countries have to figure out a way to deal with very hard distributive problems. And it's hard to see how they're going to keep a sort of sustained reduction in inequality without improving the political representation of citizens.
Thank you very much, Anna. Morgan, I would like to hear your perspective in this conversation. You are completely connected to the region. You live in Brazil. You are a representative for Brazil. Are there any lessons from the mentioned period of poverty and inequality reduction that you can believe we can learn from? In fact, Brazil was very successful reducing income inequality during the period that I mentioned before. How has your experience been on the ground with the bank regarding equity issues? With your close view in the region, can we be optimistic?
Well, thanks very much, Ana Maria. It's really a pleasure to be here, to be able to participate in this roundtable. It's a real honor. I'd like to say, I think there are reasons to be optimistic. I'm hopeful, but we should start out by recognizing that it will not be easy, given what's happened in the region and what's going on. Mindful of the multivariate sort of reality of inequality that Horacio was talking about. But when we look at just with income inequality, growth is absolutely critical, and we know we're right now with the worst prospects for prospective growth for the coming years than we've had in many, many decades. So we're starting from a place where it's not going to be easy. And we're also building on 4 decades of essentially zero productivity growth in the region, particularly in Brazil, so we're starting from a place that is not conducive. And Brazil, as you pointed out, has long been among the most unequal countries in the world, where 10% of the income distribution is received, rather, the top 10% of the income distribution receives 58.6% of all income. And when you add to that the increasing probability of disruptive and frequent climate-related disasters, you have a sort of a situation in which it's not going to be easy to make progress. However, and I think what I'd like to draw out is when one looks at what's happening in societies, and Anna's point goes to this to some extent, what I see in Brazil and in other countries is a much more organized and demanding civil society that's pushing for these rights to be recognized, for citizens to be able to participate much more effectively, and which hopefully will alter the political economy of some of the key reforms that we know address inequality. But also, and correspondingly, the president mentioned this, the G20, the Brazilian presidency of the G20 has put inequality at the center, and that's been amply embraced by the different participants of the G20 and has informed all of the different work streams that are ongoing. In addition, and speaking specifically from the perspective of someone who's engaged with Brazil, what we've seen is commitment on the part of the government to incorporate inequality transversely in the public budgeting process. And this is new. So they went through a very rigorous participatory development of the multi-year government plan, the PPA, that explicitly includes targets and the requirement to monitor the allocation of budget resources and results associated with specific groups: women, Afro-descendant populations, indigenous groups, LGBTA communities. So this is new and exciting and interesting. But in addition, and I think equally, if not more importantly, there's an explicit commitment on the part of the minister and of the ministry to focus on equality of expenditure, and particularly social expenditure. And so you now have a group, a cadre of people that are focused on evaluation and evidence approaches to program design, which meshes very well with our ongoing dialogue, and indeed we're supporting them in that. So when you think about how, and looking at from Brazil, one final ingredient, you have a tax reform. So the big challenge across the region, and from a fiscal perspective, of course, we have very regressive fiscal regimes on the income side and very poorly targeted and ineffective expenditure on the expenditure side. And so Brazil finally, after many decades, has addressed the first the tax reform. So I'm hopeful because we've learned a lot of lessons over these years of how better to target and how better to address the manifold challenges of inequality. We learned during the COVID how to ramp up, in the case of Brazil, up to 67 million people to receive temporary transfers to be able to offset the costs of or the disruption, the economic disruption associated with COVID, and how to ramp down again. We've learned that investments can be done much more effectively. We've learned how to leverage the public sector as well as the private sector, and to address some of the other sort of manifestations of inequality. So I'm hopeful. I think there's a much more systemic approach to thinking about it at a government-wide, both on the evaluation side, on the revenue side, as well as transversely throughout the budget process. So I think that allows for one to be much more optimistic in terms of the results that we may be able to obtain.
Thank you, Morgan. And you mentioned something that I believe it's very important for the region, because the region has had successes, many successes, and has done innovative policies, social policies. So we also have many things to show and many things from which to learn. So that's why it's also very important to have your voice here, Morgan, because you can bring us the on-the-ground experience to this roundtable. With the podcast, we have aimed to bring case studies and interventions that we are doing in the countries in the region to demonstrate the possibility of effecting change and the possibility of not losing optimism, as you were mentioning. President, let's move to the practical applications of the research and findings of the LASIR network. How can this research help our work with the countries in the region? Could you give us some examples of implementing some of the findings from the research?
Yes, definitely, Ana Maria, because we need to find ways to address these inequalities in the several dimensions that we talk about. But we need to do it in a very practical and very strategic-oriented. Some examples. The research from LASIR and others show that some of the most effective interventions to give everyone an equal chance is early childhood development. So we talk about inherited, but also early childhood development. So if you have high quality programs for vulnerable children in the birth through age 5, 1 to 5, very early, you can offer a return on investing on these childs of almost 14% a year, 14% a year for the rest of their life. So big benefits for many, many years. These children then will do better in school and even then in job market. So you start early and you have an impact, almost a persistent impact in inequality. So what do we do at the IDB? We finance the construction and improvement of early childhood care centers. And there are some examples like Argentina, Panama, Uruguay. And we were able to increase their coverage, usually from 1 in every 4 children enrolled in these childhood care centers to 3 out of 4. Quite an increase. This benefits the development of the children, but importantly, it developed also a benefit for the mothers. They can also start working, so their employment rose by 20%. So you improve the return for these kids, but then also allow the mothers to be employed, to raise their income. So it's a win-win. And this is the type of examples that you're asking, Ana Maria, what we can do. Let me give you another example from the IDB. A tax system to reduce inequality. You mentioned tax reform, Morgan. There's other places that have shown that a more progressive tax system in place can help reduce inequality by reducing the tax burden on the ones more vulnerable. If you are able to have a more progressive tax system, it means leaving more money in the pockets of the low-wage income earners. So the IDB, by helping countries implement more progressive tax systems, can actually help. And in Latin America and the Caribbean, this is a big help because we know that not all tax systems are progressive, quite the opposite. We don't have too many progressive tax systems. So when we have some examples, and recently Colombia embarked in tax reform too, similarly in Costa Rica, where the IDB helped create progressive personal income tax brackets, but also increase capital income taxation. And there's another way, which is increase the electronic invoice system, basically to reduce evasion. So you get more people to pay, and that also makes the tax system more progressive. So those are examples that, yes, we can do, and we should not stop. You're right. Has been inequality for several years and decades, but there are things that we can do, and we should do it based on the knowledge and the evidence we are getting from the last year.
Thank you, President. And it is clear that there are things that we can do, no? And the President mentioned early childhood, Horacio, and you have been a very well-respected researcher on that issue, and you have done extensive work on early childhood in Latin America. So if we were to imagine a society with really equal opportunities, we would expect that the cradle where you are born or your initial conditions do not define your future opportunities. That's what we would like to head to. But we know that this is not the case currently in Latin America. What effect does stimulation, nutrition, and education have to reduce this gap? How important it is to reduce these gaps, especially when the children are 1 to 5 years old?
Thank you, Ana Maria. That's a huge question. I could talk about it for about a couple of hours. I'll try to do it for a couple of minutes. First of all, I completely agree. I think we know now that there are policies that can improve the life course of disadvantaged children in a fundamental way. We know that that's possible. I was at a conference last week in Italy with Sally Grantham McGregor, who was the inventor of the celebrated Jamaica intervention, the Reach Up for very, very early childhood. And one thing that Sally said, in response to some questions during the conference, said, we know that things work. The big challenge now is how do we implement these policies. And that's not easy. It's not that there is no model that is going to work in every situation. And in that respect, there are two things that I would like to stress that are particularly challenging and particularly important. One is parental behavior. We know that the first 2 years of life, where children mostly spend time with their parents, are fundamental in many, many ways. And therefore, we need to affect how parents behave and how they interact and stimulate their children. And that's not an easy feat. It's not just a matter of money. It's a matter of the beliefs that the perceptions that people have about the process of child development. And there is lots of evidence that poor parents, for a variety of reasons, they might vary from stress to just misperceptions, don't do enough to stimulate their kids. To construct this type of interventions is not easy. And I think in that respect, it's important to link this type of policies to other policies that government do it. For instance, when we tried out this thing in Colombia, we linked it to the conditional cash transfer programs, and we used the representatives, the madre líderes of the program, to deliver the home visits that stimulate the intervention. Second point is the quality of education. When we move on to child care centers and we build up this type of centers, it's great to have a new initiative that promotes this and the use and the effect that it might have on female labor supply and the like. But it's also extremely important and difficult to guarantee that the sort of services that are offered within the centers have a high quality. Again, we've done another study in Colombia where we show that simply increasing the budget of nurseries by 40-50% did not have any impact. Then when you add to that a little bit of training on the teachers, then we see positive impacts. So this goes to show that if you want to do it well, and that's going to be very important. One last point, and I apologize for over-talking. What happened within families, as I was mentioning before, is important. We see that poor parents face very difficult challenges, and sometimes they have to decide who goes to school, which of the children. And so and sometimes there is discrimination, gender discrimination. Some of the programs in Latin America have received a really important effect by delivering the grants to women rather than men. Progressa was one of those, but many others have done that thing. So having a look at what happens within the families, what happens within communities, the role of community is going to be very, very important to guarantee that people see these interventions not just as limosna, but rather a contribution and a help from the state and from society.
Thank you, Horacio. You mentioned here what individuals can do, but what the states can do, and the importance of investment, but also the importance of having high-quality programs that work. Ana, you do a very important study on education and how education is segregated in Latin America and the Caribbean. And we have very compelling evidence that early childhood programs are important, that education is important to reduce inequality, and these proposals really don't generate major disagreement in the region. We all know that we should be investing in education. But when we go from what we say to what happens to the action, really the investment in education is not high enough. We don't see a great political commitment or an investment as significant as there could be. Why does this happen? And can you tell us a little bit what you found in the chapter that you did on this?
Thank you, Ana Maria. Yeah, this is a very complex question, and I would say that part of the answer has to do with something that Horacio was already mentioning a bit before, and is related to a fragmented social contract. And I want to start by saying that it is indeed puzzling that the public education systems in our countries are not stronger, because many of our countries have some of the ingredients in the political systems that are associated with a strong interclass support for public education. And just to give you one example, it has been argued that systems that include proportional representation, because they force consensus, they build a strong alliance between middle-class households and low-income people in favor of public education. And yet, what we find in our work, Cecilia Rosell, Pilar Mansi, and myself, is that the middle class in the region is split. And a substantial proportion of them are choosing to send their kids to private schools. And just to give you a sense of the magnitude of this, in urban areas in Peru, for example, we calculate that the probability that a middle class household sends their children to a private school is around 60%. And in Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, and Uruguay, it's close to 40%. And even in countries that have the lowest rates of enrollment in private schools, of Mexico and Bolivia, a middle-class household approximately has a probability of 30 or 20% probability of sending their children to private school. Now, of course, it will not be surprising to say that we also find that children from very wealthy households are already attending private schools. And so what this means is that, contrary to what happens in some countries in the OECD that also use proportional representation, in the region we're not seeing very strong interclass coalitions in support of public education. And perhaps a little bit more problematic, sort of drawing from public opinion data, we find that basically people who opt out of public schools end up having very different attitudes toward the role of the state in terms of the provision of education, but also more generally in terms of what the state should be doing to redistribute income in societies. And so this creates sort of like a sorting mechanism in which people who have worse evaluations about public schools end up going for private schools, and then they don't support funding the public education system that they left behind. So this, I think, politically is very challenging, and it's not to say that the system is beyond repair, but I think it is important that we recognize that families are making decisions confronting a system that provides very little opportunities for social mobility. And so it is very important for governments to figure out a way to make massive improvements in the quality of public education. And it's worth noting that here many countries in the region have lots of room for improving efficiency. And this we also see in another of last year's chapters by Matias Guiso, Carlos Scartaccini, and Mariano Tomasi. And so they do show that this is an area in which many governments in the region can actually achieve great improvement. And I would say that by doing so President Wolfgang was already saying that improving education, it's a win-win. I would say maybe it's a win-win-win in the sense that better schools could actually go a long way at reducing social distance and creating more cohesive social contracts in our region.
Thank you, and that's a very powerful message, no? The role of education also to creating more cohesive societies that works toward a common goal. That's important. Morgan, I know you live very closely with the pandemic and the effects of the pandemic in our region and the effects it had in the economy. We have fiscal burdens in our countries. We had school performance, health, among many other issues that the pandemic affected. What stories have you experienced firsthand that you can share with us? Is there a model that the bank has supported that could be shared and that could be an important lessons for other countries in the region?
Well, let me start with an anecdote that my first official day in Brazil was March 1st, 2020. So I had about 10 days before things got very, very difficult. But that said, we had indeed quite a few opportunities to engage with our clients and to think about how to address those challenges over the 4 years that I've been in Brazil. And we could talk about temporary maintenance of formal sector jobs. We helped maintain 10 million formal sector jobs in the heart of the pandemic. But let me talk about education, because I think it's really critical to the discussion today. And there are some really interesting stories that came out of the pandemic, but also that I think have broader implications. So the empirical evidence is pretty clear that completing secondary education in Brazil, as in everywhere in the region, has huge returns. Some estimate over 30% increase in income. But in Brazil in particular, because we were the schools in Brazil were closed amongst the longest of anywhere in the world, there was a really significant impact. In fact, the IMF recently calculated that amongst the G20 countries, Brazil has the greatest lifetime income losses, over 9% associated. So a really major issue associated with kids that were unable to continue to go to school. And we saw that in real time and tried with our different partners to figure out how to address. And it so happened that in the northern region of Brazil, both in Amazonas and in Pará, but particularly Amazonas, we had a long-standing relationship that was focused on thinking rigorously about how to address a very important inequality that is persistent, that had to do with essentially being urban or being rural, but being rural in Amazonas state, which is 3 times the size of France and as densely forested and has, to get by boat to some of the communities can take, several weeks. So it's a major challenge. And what the approach that we took was to develop, and we supported, was to develop a media center that provides very high quality, pertinent, relevant, and live classes that can be sent out, beamed to the remote corners of 60 remote municipalities of Amazonas. We have 26,000 students that are able to complete high school it's interactive. So, and the difference is that you have a tutor in every one of those classrooms that are spread throughout the interior of Amazonas State. And what this provides is real-time interactive with very pertinent pedagogical material that are provided to the kids, and that allows for interactions and for there to be a community. And so what this provoked was a 15% increase in secondary school coverage in the state. So a massive jump. And not only that, and when we talk about, so the jump is important, but quality is equally important. We had a 57% increase in the indicators from the Brazil's national evaluation of learning, which is the INDEB. So we had, which is way above trend for the rest of the states. So you had the ability to, through one intervention over time, dramatically increase coverage, dramatically increase learning, and also dramatically reduce overage students, which dropped 44%. We've done a similar thing in Pará, which is also faces similar challenges. But so to tie it back to the pandemic, so we have this system that was to address inequality. But when the pandemic hit, we were faced with a secondary dilemma, which was in Amazonas State, 440,000 kids depend on school lunches. Brazil is amongst the most effective countries in the world at providing school lunches. It's a real model. But when the pandemic hit, this, which is the principal primary meal for many of the kids, all of a sudden was no longer available. And so what we sought to do and we supported was to create a system that sort of leveraged this decentralized approach to education and provided 40 distribution centers throughout the interior of Amazonas State and delivered food to 440,000, half of whom were outside of the center, outside of the urban areas and remote areas, and some of which required 40 days by boat to get to. But we created the system where there were 3,000 professionals involved, 40 distribution centers, and provided meals that were essentially sustenance for kids throughout the pandemic. So I take this, it's very unique, but what it allowed us to leverage this agility and a system that's decentralized and focused on addressing inequalities, but to pivot and address what was really a humanitarian crisis and allowed us to continue to provide sustenance to those families.
So what we see here throughout this discussion is we have challenges, significant challenges in the region, but also possibilities of affecting change, of doing and changing things through specific actions or through policies or tax reforms or many other ways of changing, and that the IDB is ready to back the countries to help them with this. President, back to you. What have we learned from last year about what works to reduce inequality?
So the other day I got some summary of the papers, so rich papers, so many papers, and we had an effort to try to summarize what are the lessons in terms of not only of knowledge and evidence, but for us at the AIB, what are the lessons for policies that we can try to help. So let me tell you what are our summary. And number one, you need to invest in early childhood programs. We mentioned early education, that Anna mentioned too, but also nutrition and health care at the beginning. So invest in education from 0 to 5, huge returns, but also invest in health and nutrition at the early stages. Vaccination programs. Morgan mentioned his experience in the pandemics with vaccination. Vaccination is very democratic because it gives a level playing field to everybody that gets a vaccination, and that's very important to start changing things. Number two, as we all mentioned here, is education. And here I'm not talking only about early education, but also expand secondary and even university education, because human capital seems to be very important to reduce inequality. The region has large educational gaps. There's a quality challenge, not only in terms of number of people that go, but also the quality. So there's a large gap in several of our countries. So more human capital, more education. So that's number 2. Number 3, we talk about socioeconomic policies, and here some of our social protection systems. Horacio mentioned Progressa, but there is also Familia and others of conditional transfers and non-contributing pensions. We know that they narrow income gaps and are effective in reducing inequality. So yes, we do know some of them that work. We need to be able to reach the right population. So that's another thing that is very important, that we not only know what to do, but we need to find out to whom we can address these policies. So we need to do a better job on implementing those policies that we believe are important. Just to give you some data, over 125 million people in 17 countries in the region, just 17 out of the 26 countries that are the regional members of the IDB, have benefited from these conditional transfers. This is 22% of the population. So if we want to do scale, this is a place we are thinking about it. Number 4, and we mentioned this already, progressive fiscal policy to reduce inequality. We know that it can help, and it has to be well designed. It is not very disseminated in the region, the progressive. There has been more, and I agree, more progressive policies, but still a lot to do. Remember that we have a lot of informality in the region, and that's also a big driver of inequality. Last, and I might say not least, macro policies. What is macro policies? Morgan mentioned growth. Well, if we continue with productivity growth of 0, that will be difficult to do. So one of our main objectives is productivity and growth, and that's so on one side inequality and poverty, but the other side growth and productivity, and they are interrelated. The other part of the macro is inflation. And we have some cases in the region of higher inflation, sometimes very high inflation, and that's very regressive. So we cannot forget the last part, which is macro policies, and they're very so those are things that we know. And I think at IDB, we need to be the bridge between the knowledge and the practice, and be close to the governments that can absorb this practice. So a little bit of training, as you mentioned, is helpful. So let's give a little bit of training. Let's bring the knowledge to the region out of the lessons that we can get from partnership as the last year.
Thank you. And this table is a way to bring the knowledge to the region, and to have also a discussion with the people that are in the region, leading those discussions as Morgan is doing, and the president as well. President, we are coming to the end of this meeting. And before we go, I would like you to ask whether, what do you believe are the priorities to tackle in the region? Here at the IDB, we would love to do many things, but we need to prioritize. So what do you think are the priorities to tackle inequality in the region?
So first, we need to be able to be strategically selective. We cannot do everything, and there's no amount of resources, both in terms of people, money, to do everything. So we need to be strategic selective, which is one of our main goals. How to do it? Based on evidence. What works, what does not work. Be humble, that know that this is not going to be an easy task. So we need to be able to find the places and how to do it in the right way, and in the way that we can actually scale things. I think at the IDP we are privileged to be able to do this type of work where I mentioned we can be the bridge between the knowledge and the practitioners, the bridge between academia and policy making. We are close to government. We have 26 offices with a very large chunk of the staff in the region. So if we can bring that with this mentality of impact, of selectivity, of trying to do things in the right way, I think we can go a long way. But as several of you have mentioned, this has been there for decades. And I say decades, not to say centuries, because of slavery and others. So let's be humble. Let's do our best. We know what works. We need to implement, and we need to do our best. And I think if we do our best, we can improve the lives of millions of people in the region.
And indeed, with this, we close. And this is the launch of the podcast, of our first podcast of the series. And what we can see here today is that the podcast is contributing to gaining a better understanding of inequality, its causes, but also its consequences for the region and how to actively address it. This is a first step towards informed decision-making, which is important, building consensus, as Anna mentioned, for improvement and demanding the changes that we need for the region. You can listen to the podcast on various platforms such as Google Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, by searching for BIT Voces en Acción, where you will find the first 2 episodes. You can also listen on the Spreaker platform, which is currently in the chat right now, the link. And we will be sharing 1 podcast per month, precisely on the 2nd Tuesday of each month. Anyone who wishes to receive a notification or an email to receive the new episode, news on whether the new episode is published, can subscribe to our mailing list on the website, and the link is also just sent through the chat. Thank you all for being part of this discussion today. Thank you very much. And thank you to those who join us from the region. Now enjoy this podcast. Thank you very much.